Hello, I'm Ross Bradford, Deputy General Counsel at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The National Trust appreciates your efforts to help affect change at the local, state, and federal level. This video is a part of a series that provides guidance to those advocating on behalf of historic preservation. This short 15 to 20-minute presentation will focus on the basics of nonprofit lobbying and avoiding political campaign intervention. The outline for the presentation is as follows. First, we'll begin by talking about what is the prohibition on political campaign intervention? Can nonprofits lobby? What is lobbying? Examples of lobbying, and then we'll wrap up by discussing state and local lobbying issues. Generally, nonprofits are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. There are a number of clear violations of this rule. Nonprofits can't make contributions to PACs or to candidates. They can't endorse candidates. They can't make statements in opposition to or in support of candidates, and they can't give preferential treatment to candidates. Like many nonprofits, we all work on issue-based advocacy matters on a regular basis, but we have to be careful that our issues that we advocate for don't cross the line into political activity. And the IRS has a set of facts and circumstances that they use or factors that they use to decide or to determine whether issue-based advocacy crosses into the realm of political campaign activity. So it's things like when you're doing issue-based advocacy, are you identifying a candidate for office? Are you approving or disapproving a candidate's views? How close in time to an election are you doing your issue-based advocacy? Are there advocacy messages that refer to voting in an election? Is the issue that you're advocating for a distinguishing issue among the candidates for the office that they're running for? And then, is the timing of the communication and identification of a candidate related to non-electoral event, such as a scheduled vote on specific legislation? Is that also something that's so close in time to an election that it might be viewed as the nonprofit expressing an endorsement for or an opposition to that candidate? So there are a variety of areas that nonprofits can operate in during elections that are permissible. A lot of nonprofits generally don't do these, but we provide a list of them. The IRS provides some guidelines on this. You can have get out the vote or voter registration drives. You can publish voting records. You can have candidate questionnaires and voter guides. You can conduct debates and forums. You can educate candidates. And the most important one is nonprofit employees in their personal time can conduct political activities. Most often, at work in this area that happens is nonprofits are trying to educate candidates. So you can urge support for policies. You can provide policy papers. Generally, you want to try to do the same paper you're giving to the public, and you want to make sure that you're giving it to all the candidates equally. But one thing you can't do is ask a candidate to take a pledge. So you can't say, if you're elected, you agree to vote, will you agree to vote for this bill? Because that would indicate the nonprofit's preference for you in winning the election. So nonprofit employees in their personal time can conduct political activity, but it has to be in their personal capacity, and you can't use an organization's resources. So you can't use your work email. You shouldn't be using work equipment, phones, copiers, and you shouldn't be doing any of these activities during work time. The other area that's a little bit more tricky is the use of your job title or your affiliation. Typically, you want to avoid using that, but if for some reason you are using it, you want to make a clear disclaimer and identify that you're not speaking on behalf of the nonprofit that you work for. So another thing that happens during an election year is that we may want to praise or criticize a public official for their actions. So let's say a piece of legislation was passed, and we want to praise the folks who supported it. So you can recognize them for their good actions. but you want to make sure that recognition is it coincides with the actual policy action that's taking place. So if there was a vote that just happened, or there was a hearing, or the legislation was introduced, you want to make sure that public recognition, whether it's in the form of an ad in a newspaper, or an ad on social media, or posting on social media, you want to make sure that is not close in time to an election, because it might be seen as um, a, a, an endorsement for, or an opposition to a particular candidate, depending on how you've publicized those actions. So typically in any of those kind of praising or criticizing incumbents, you want to make sure you're not referring to the election generally, or voting, or removing someone from office for their actions. You want to make sure you're not focusing on their character, and you want to make sure that if it is an issue you're going to praise or criticize someone on, that it really isn't a defining issue or point of contention among the candidates generally. So if you can follow these couple rules, you'll sort of steer clear of this prohibition on political campaign intervention. So with that, we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about lobbying and nonprofits. There's a general misunderstanding that nonprofits are not permitted to lobby. That's incorrect. The IRS recognizes that nonprofits can lobby, but they just can't do it as more than a substantial part of their activities. So the problem with this is that this standard is a little vague. What is a substantial part of a nonprofit's activities? And so the IRS gives you two options. You can use what's called the substantial part test, where you basically have to make the case that your activities for lobbying are not a substantial part of your organization's work. Or you can do the easier option, which is the expenditure test, or otherwise known as the 501(h) election. And the good thing about this election is that the IRS has provided nonprofits with very clear financial limits on the amount of money you can spend based on your organization's overall budget. And then they've broken that down into amounts that you can spend on direct lobbying and amounts you can spend on grassroots lobbying. And generally, you can spend 25% of your total amount on grassroots lobbying, and then the rest can go towards direct lobbying. And it's all based on your organization's overall budget and the amount. There is a cap on this. So for organizations that have budgets over $17 million, the maximum is $1 million you could spend per year on lobbying. So what type of expenditures are you supposed to track when you do lobbying? Well, you want to track any sort of compensation of employees. You want to track vendors that are lobbyists. You want to, track any sort of cost associated with communicating with public officials. So if you're traveling somewhere, if you have airfare, hotels, if you're developing communications, that means social media, emails, or even hard print materials. And then you'd also want to consider postage or other expenses like overhead, or payments to third parties like a third-party lobbyist. So there's generally two big camps of lobbying that we talk about in this area: direct lobbying, and that's basically where the organization is directly talking to a member of a legislative body and asking them to vote a certain way. The other form of lobbying is grassroots lobbying, and that's any communication with the public about a specific legislative proposal that expresses a view and calls for action to communicate to that legislator in order to influence legislation. So, in order to have grassroots lobbying, you have to meet those three components. You have to have a specific piece of legislation, the organization has to reflect a viewpoint, and then you have to encourage contact with the elected representative. Generally speaking, legislation is any act by Congress or a legislative body at the state or local level. That could mean a local city council, a county board of supervisors. It can also include public referendum. So one thing I didn't mention earlier was that public referendum, the public is acting as the legislative body and passing a law and implementing it. And so if you're doing any sort of work on public referendum, most of your work is going to be direct lobbying, because the people are the folks that are passing the law. So it's not only just a specific piece of legislation, it could be a proposal for new legislation. So even if you're you're coming to a elected representative and asking them to pass an existing piece of legislation, that would be direct lobbying. Or if you have your own proposal for a new piece of legislation that hasn't even been introduced, that would be direct lobbying. So in order to be considered direct lobbying, do you have to communicate directly with a member of a legislative body? And the answer to that is false. Um, Obviously, direct communication with them is direct lobbying, but if you communicate with their staff, that's also direct lobbying. They're essentially acting on behalf of the people they work for in that office. So anytime you reach out to a legislative assistant or someone in an elected representative's office to conduct lobbying, that would be considered direct lobbying activities. Executive, judicial, and administrative bodies are not legislative bodies. This is a little confusing sometimes at the local level because some bodies have quasi-legislative abilities. But generally speaking, school boards, housing authorities, sewer and water districts, zoning boards, and other type of similar administrative bodies are not legislative bodies. So when you're working before them, you wouldn't consider that work to be lobbying. Now, if you are, let's say, you have to get something locally landmarked or designated, that ultimately might need to be approved by the local city council or county board of supervisors. And that official act where they're going to pass an ordinance or a law or provision to enact a local designation, that would most likely be a legislative body action, and then anything that you've done to support that would be direct lobbying and any associated grassroots lobbying. There's a lot of work that nonprofits do that's not considered lobbying. So you can have white papers, booklets about the work that you do that's basically nonpartisan analysis. So you could have a study about why historic windows are better than replacement windows and have general background about that. You could have discussions about why maintaining historic buildings is better than building new buildings. That sort of general primer information would be not lobbying unless you're identifying legislation directly in it. If you're responding to requests for technical information from a legislative body, that's not considered lobbying because you're replying to the government. And then if there's just any other sort of general, broad socioeconomic sort of examinations that your organization is doing, let's say they're going to address climate resilience in a study, then that wouldn't generally be considered lobbying. One area that's, I think, unique to historic preservation is the national monument designation process. And it's you can designate a national monument either through an act of Congress or through a presidential proclamation. If you're going to go the act of Congress route, all of the work associated with that would be lobbying. But if you're going to go the presidential proclamation route, i.e., you're basically going to work with the administration to have the president sign into law a proclamation declaring a certain site a national monument. That wouldn't be lobbying because they're doing that under their executive power authority. When we talk about these types of expenditures and tracking them, typically speaking, at the organization level, you're going to be tracking time through your timekeeping system, your timesheets, and you're going to want to account for not only the actual time you're doing the lobbying, but the time it takes to prepare to lobby. So let's say we have an advocacy week coming up, and we're going to spend 3 or 4 days worth of meetings kind of preparing for ultimately a couple meetings with elected officials at the end of the week. All of that time you spent preparing your messaging points, your talking points, all of that time preparing to lobby is also time that you would need to track. So if you post a story on social media and you state your organization's position on the legislation and you ask the public to contact the legislator, is that considered grassroots lobbying? And the answer to that is yes. So anytime you use social media for issue-based advocacy, lobbying, you're going to want to make sure that you're tracking your time on that, including the time to prepare, create those pieces of media that you're going to post. If you had to pay external parties to create them, those are all expenses that you would want to check. You would want to track. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. I've talked a lot about sort of the IRS and their guidelines for lobbying generally, and a lot of that applies at the federal level. But lobbying is not just at the federal level. Lobbying takes place at the state and local levels. So for IRS 990 tracking purposes, you're going to want to account for any type of lobbying, whether it's at the state, local, or federal levels. But in addition to the IRS requirements, there are certain state and local laws that you may have to comply with. And those may require a variety of different things like registering your organization, filing reports on a quarterly basis. And a lot of that is there's not a lot of uniformity to that. So you're going to have to look closely at what the local municipality or the state requires in order to conduct lobbying. And this is all for the purpose of providing transparency to the public so they know who's influencing their lawmakers. So a lot of times, even though there's not a lot of uniformity here, you can boil this down into two things. It oftentimes what will trigger a registration or compliance with local law will be the number of contacts you make or the amount of money that you spend to influence legislation. And so some examples of that in California, if you spend more than $5,000 per quarter, you've got to register and file your lobbying expenses with the state. New York has a different threshold. It's $5,000 per year. And then Pennsylvania is $2,500 per quarter. And then drilling down a little bit further to the local level, in San Francisco, for example, if your nonprofit were to do any sort of lobbying and you employed a third-party lobbyist, if they make one or more contacts, you need to register. Or if your employees of your organization make 5 or more contacts, then you would want to register. Again, there's not any uniformity. You really have to go to your Secretary of State's website. They often have lobbying primers or guides. Counties or municipalities will have the same that provide sort of a list of things that you need to check off in order to conduct lobbying. So generally speaking, nonprofits can lobby and nonprofits do lobby. And when you conduct an advocacy campaign, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level, there are things that you want to be thinking about. You want to think about the amount of money you're spending, the time you're spending, the time to prepare. Are you going to be using things like social media and making sure that the folks that are working on your social media team are tracking their time? If there's any sort of landmark designation involved, you want to look closely at how that landmark designation is passed and whether ultimately a legislative body will have to approve that designation. If there are ballot measures or referendums that are before the community, recall that that's actually direct lobbying because you're lobbying the public to pass a specific bill versus going to the legislative body to pass a bill. And then finally, in the nonprofit world, we all often get grant funds from third-party grantors, whether it's public funds or private funders. And the general rule is most grant funders don't allow use of their funds for lobbying expenses. So you're going to want to make sure that any funding that you're getting in a grant cycle isn't being used indirectly or directly for lobbying purposes. So thanks for your time today. I hope you learned a couple things about nonprofits and lobbying, and we'll look forward to talking to you again. Take care.